welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. You know, you have to be a certain age to thoroughly appreciate today's episode, but don't worry, it's still a great tale either way, no matter how old you are. This used to be called Disneyland of the East, Freedomland, an incredible theme park that operated in the Bronx, New York for just 5 years, and then it suddenly shut down, leaving a lot of patrons kind of sad. Well, it turns out there's a lot more to the story. A lot more. And you're not going to believe the reason why Freedomland was even built in the first place, and then why it closed down. Our guest today has written 2 books on this subject, Freedomland USA, The Definitive History, and 6 years after that, More Definitive History. That author is Mike Virgintino, and he's going to be along in just a moment with a truly unbelievable tale. This week's trivia question, what do Black Rock, Connecticut, Setauket, Long Island, and West Point all have in common? Well, stay tuned after the main program for the answer, which will give you the topic for next week's show. Freedomland, a theme park in the Bronx, New York for only 5 years. A park that had, frankly, an incredible theme-oriented series of sections depicting various aspects of America's history at that point in time. So why did it go out of business after just 5 years to be replaced by the enormous Co-op City housing complex? That's often referred to as the city within a city. Well, it turns out the fix was in for Freedomland before it was even opened. And we can thank Mike Virgintino for doing all the background legwork to figure all this out and then publishing it in his book, Freedomland USA, The Definitive History. It's really an incredible tale, particularly for those of us, like me, who are old enough to have visited the park sometime between 1960 and 1964. So, Mike, great to have you on the program, and I hate to admit this, but, I'm old enough now to say that I actually was at Freedomland when it existed from 1960 to, 1964. I was a young kid, I'll say that much. But I do remember going there, and so I'm going to very much enjoy this interview. And before we get into why it was called Disneyland of the East, I want to talk first about the guy who was behind it. This guy, C.V. Wood. Apparently, he had quite a start himself with Disney out in the West. Could you explain who C.V. Wood is and how he plays into this?
CV, which stands for Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood. His friends called him CV or called him Woody. One of his later jobs after World War II was with the Stanford Research Institute out in California. At that time, it was part of Stanford University. It's now an independent research company. While he's there, 2 brothers walk in with the concept, the idea that they want to create a theme park in Southern California. And that happened to be Walt Disney and Roy Disney. Stanford Research takes the assignment of doing a feasibility study. Should the Disneys go through with the park, or is it something so far-fetched and so expensive that they need to abandon the idea? Well, CV is put in charge of the Stanford Research Institute team to work with the Disney brothers. And over the course of a couple of years, they do the entire soup to nuts of a feasibility study. From that study, the Disney brothers decide they have the resources, or they know where they can tap into financial resources, that they're going to go through with their park called Disneyland. CV was so entrenched with them that he even found the land, the orange grove, that became Disneyland. So once they decide to go ahead, they hire CV away from Stanford Research Institute and make him the first employee of Disneyland, vice president and general manager. And his job is to work with Walt and the Disney Imagineers and bring Walt's imagination to life. Roy Disney is very involved. He's the money guy. He's raising the funds and watching the bottom line. Walt is the imagination person, and Woody is bringing this all together in order to create Disneyland. Walt being a creative person, CV being kind of running his own show. Over the short term that they were together, they start butting heads. And about a few months, maybe 6 months after Disneyland opens, they part ways. Some will say Disney fired him. Some will say that Disney didn't have the stomach to do that. He had Roy fire him. And some say that CV saw the writing on the wall and decided to branch out into other endeavors on his own. So they part ways, and for the rest of Walt Disney's life, and for I think possibly almost all, if not all, of Roy Disney's life, C.V. Wood is never recognized by the Disney Corporation. Not until the company is out of the hands of the Disney family has the company kind of recognized the contributions of Woody and what he meant to the creation of Disneyland.
So that's an incredible backstory, and I want to put this in context for people. So Disneyland in Anaheim opened in 1955. They part ways shortly after this, and it wasn't going to be a Disney presence in Florida until 1971. That's when Walt Disney World opened in Florida. And so in this time in between, right, 1960, something's going to open on the East Coast, and Woody, it turns out, is centrally involved with this. Please pick up the story.
While Woody was thinking of what he was going to do next, he is approached by several entrepreneurs and investors, not only on the West Coast, but around the country. The thought was, look at the success of Disneyland and what the Disney brothers are doing. And a lot of entrepreneurs and investors said, why can't we do that in our neck of the woods throughout the United States? The reason being, and you brought up the key point, this was 1955, 1956. If you're living on the East Coast, if you're living down in Texas or in Chicago, Mom and Dad are not taking you as a child out to California by plane. Very few had the experience of going cross-country by car as a child. So Disneyland at that time was drawing from about 100-mile radius. People would come in for the day. They built some hotels that people wanted to stay over 2 or 3 days. But anywhere else in the country, the only way you were seeing Disneyland was if you were watching the Walt Disney television show or if you were watching the Mouseketeers on television. So these entrepreneurs said, well, let's bring in the guy who helped put together Disney World for the Disney brothers. C.V. Wood starts a company called Marco Engineering, and he hires some former Disney Imagineers. He also hires Hollywood people, directors, as well as prop people, set designers, and other people from the television world. He gets commissioned to build parks across the country. Over the course of several years, about 20 parks are placed on the chalkboard, but only a handful actually are built. The first one is in Golden, Colorado, called Magic Mountain. That one, as Woody is building it, it has a soft opening after about 18 months of construction, and within 2 years, it closes into bankruptcy. Now, let me explain what happens here. Woody comes in not as a manager of these parks. He comes in as the creator and designer and builder of these parks, and then he moves on to other projects. The issue is not enough money, or these entrepreneurs don't really know how to run an amusement park or a theme park, but that's out of Woody's hands. So after he leaves Golden, Colorado, he starts building Pleasure Island outside of Boston. Now, that park lasts 10 years. It opens in 1959 and closes in 1969. During that decade, it goes through 2 or 3 bankruptcies and corporate changes eventually, and then it closes and becomes an office park. While that park is opening in 1959, Woody is in the Bronx starting to build, to create Freedomland, which would open in 1960. And leaving Freedomland just for a moment, while Freedomland is opening in 1960, Woody is creating and building a park in Arlington, Texas, known as Six Flags Over Texas. And that park still exists while the other ones don't, because the entrepreneur who was behind it was an oil tycoon, was a solid businessman. He built a business blueprint of how he wanted the park to operate. And that park is going to be celebrating, I think, its 63rd anniversary. And even though it has changed hands, corporate hands over the years, it has always turned a profit every year. So getting back to Freedomland, Woody does come into the New York area, and they start construction of Freedomland in August of 1959.
Now, what they found there, and anybody who has ever been in the tri-state region and driven the roads and knows the location, where the Interstate 95 confluence with the Hutchinson River Parkway is, there's actually 2 locations, but people will know this one is where Co-op City is today. Those are the 300-plus acres where Freedomland was built and where it existed for 4 years. It was marshland when he started, wasn't it?
Yes, correct. All that area going back hundreds of years was marshland. Because it was marshland and the tides coming in from Eastchester Bay, the Dutch and then the English put up mills there to take advantage of the water power, of the tidal power coming in.
Now, one of the strategic, maybe we'll call it a problem or shortcoming of Freedomland when it first opened, was that it had this unusual theme to it of having different thematic approaches to American history displayed in different settings, but it didn't have quite as many thrill rides as maybe people wanted at amusement parks. Could you talk about that dichotomy there?
Freedomland was planned as an American history theme park. There weren't really coasters or thrill rides at Freedomland. Those rides really hadn't come into effect yet, with the exception of maybe Coney Island would have its roller coasters, several parks would have roller coasters, but all those other thrill ride attractions were not really in development at that point. So Freedomland set up its park as 7 themed areas, 6 of them dealing with America's historical past, and then 1 addressing contemporary future history, more or less based on the space race with the USSR at the time. A lot of the attractions were things such as a mule ride through the Rocky Mountains, a reenactment of the Chicago fire in which guests could actually pump water. You entered the park in little old New York where you had traditional old shops, tugboats. You had cowboy shootouts in the Wild West, as well as supporting all of this, a number of major corporate sponsors. Woody had really developed corporate sponsors for Disneyland, and he took that concept to other parks. At one point, Freedomland had about 20 to 25 corporate sponsors.
So one of the things I have to tell you that drew me to this story immediately was when I found out, and now we come to the conclusion of what happened to this poor C.V. Wood at Freedomland. But as you tell the story, his financial backers never really intended for him to succeed, did they? They always had another plan in mind.
That's right. There was a backstory to this. And Woody kind of got an inkling to this as the park was opening, but he never learned the full story. During the late 1950s into the early 1960s, the city planners of New York City knew that certain areas of the city were going to have financial issues going into the mid-1960s. They knew certain areas were going to economically collapse. What they needed to do was keep people, residents in the city for the tax base and for the jobs. The city created several modern housing projects that could handle thousands of people, had elevators, central air conditioning, not like the buildings that had been built during the 1920s through the 1940s. They come up with 3 housing projects: Rochdale Village in Queens, Starrett City in Brooklyn, and Co-op City in the Bronx. The plans for Co-op City were already drawn up, and the plan was to place it on this marshland. But they couldn't do it. They were stopped by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which monitors all our waterways and marshlands across the country. What they told the city planners is that from about 1958, you were going to have to drive pilings into the ground and test them every 6 months, every 12 months, to see if the tide coming in and rushing out every day would affect anything built on that property. And you're going to have to study this for 20 years, which would take you to 1968, 1969. The city could not wait that long. So someone, and I think it was collectively everyone, twisted the arm of the Army Corps of Engineers. And they cried uncle. And they said, okay, if you put something on the property that's not a permanent structure, that could be easily taken apart or moved, and it's 2 to 3 stories tall, and it lasts for 5 years. And after that 5 years, the structures are tested. Instead of the pilings, you have these structures, and as long as the structures don't have cracks in the walls or ceilings and there's no other physical damage to the structures, we'll give you variances that you can build the housing you want on this 400 acres of marshland, and you can start building after the 5 years. Well, how tall are structures in an amusement park or a theme park? 2 to 3 stories. Supposedly the Freedomland buildings passed muster if they were even tested at all at the end of 5 years. Freedomland lasts exactly the 5 years just to get to the part where they qualify for the variances. The park closes in early September 1964 for the season, and in October of 1964 they're in bankruptcy court, declaring bankruptcy and show what will be done with the land. They present in bankruptcy court the plans for Co-op City. It was a real estate scheme from the very beginning. Unknown to Woody. He thought they wanted to do more with the land, but he never knew in this capacity. And I'll tell you one interesting story. I met a fellow who was 16, 17 years old at the time, and he worked at the park, and his father was second in command of the security force at Freedomland. And one day his father came home about 10 in the evening. His son was already home. And as he walked in to their home, this fellow's mother asked his father, well, how was your day? He says, oh, the day was fine, nothing unusual, except, he goes, I was up at the corporate offices for a meeting today, and I heard some of senior management, along with the landowner, who was William Zeckendorf, say something that they're looking to the future of the land, hoping to put what they're calling a city within a city. That was 1961. So they already knew what they were going to do with the land. I found an article, and it was an interview with William Zeckendorf, again, the landowner of these 400 acres of marshland. And they asked him about his various real estate investments, and they asked him about his involvement with amusement parks and theme parks. What a lot of people don't know, this William Zeckendorf, he was a real estate developer. He knew the Disneys. He was an investor in Disneyland. He was an investor in the park Woody built in Colorado, the one he built up in Boston, and Six Flags over Texas. And when they asked him about Freedomland in this interview, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course you know it was just a placeholder for the land. When I found that article, I said, what does he mean it's a placeholder for the land? I started doing research and backtracking. And then all these stories came up of how Freedomland was literally just a device to hold the land until they obtained the variances to build Co-op City.
Now, Mike has written 2 books on Freedomland. The second, he says, after a number of former employees read his first book and came forward to him to share more of what they knew, or at least saw. He claims that these employees told him stories such as they weren't getting paid as the park entered its final year of operation. They say they saw potential buyers of attractions being shown around. They also say they saw money being taken out in the middle of the night in briefcases, and they realized that sometimes the receipts weren't matching the ticket sales. The title of that second book, Freedomland USA, More Definitive History. Well, that wraps up yet another episode of Amazing Tales About History. You know, Mike did all this incredible research on Freedomland despite one overwhelming roadblock. He says the original park records have either been lost or destroyed. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Mike Virgintino, author of Freedomland USA, The Definitive History, as well as More Definitive History, published 6 years after the first book. The answer to this week's trivia question, what do Black Rock, Connecticut, Setauket, Long Island, and West Point all have in common? Well, they were, of course, locations of either spy rings or some sort of treason, espionage, dating back to the Revolutionary War. And next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to speak with a history aficionado who not only knows the tales behind the likes of spies Nathan Hale and Caleb Brewster and John Andre, but who actually bicycled and kayaked his way along the routes they followed to draw attention to the fascinating history that occurred. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.